On the morning of February 28, 2026, the world woke up to history being rewritten in the Middle East. News of a joint U.S. and Israeli airstrike against Iran spread across the globe within seconds. Trump made a statement on social media. The great operation has begun. And with that bold declaration, decades of accumulated rage had unfortunately turned into a war. This video is not a fear video. This video is not a propaganda video either. This video was made for those who want to understand this historic development in all its dimensions. What really happened? How will America be affected by this war? What will change in the economy? And what does history tell us? If you're ready, let's begin. Since the Iranian Islamic Revolution of 1979, relations between the U.S. and Iran have never returned to normal. After the revolution, Iranian students stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and held 52 Americans hostage for 444 days, which completely severed ties between the two countries. From that day forward, the two nations launched proxy wars across the globe, imposed sanctions on each other, and at times came to the very brink of war. During the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, America supported Iraq. It provided Saddam Hussein with weapons and intelligence, because back then the real enemy was revolutionary Iran. Paradoxically, this support America gave to Iraq later transformed Saddam into an uncontrollable power, and for that reason laid the groundwork for the Gulf Wars. History sometimes contains such bitter ironies. After 2001, with the U.S. invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, Iran found itself completely squeezed between two countries where America had intervened. However, this situation paradoxically also presented Iran with an opportunity. Iran noticed the power vacuum in the region and wanted to take advantage of it, and it succeeded. By supporting Shia militant groups in Iraq, strengthening Hezbollah in Lebanon, and forging an alliance with the Houthis in Yemen, it remarkably expanded its regional influence. The nuclear deal, JCPOA, signed during the Obama era in 2015, created a brief moment of optimism. Iran agreed to limit its nuclear program, while the West was easing the sanctions. However, with Donald Trump's unilateral withdrawal from the agreement in 2018, this collapse pushed Iran back into a cornered position. Iran responded in turn by increasing its uranium enrichment activities. The conflict that erupted in June 2025, which went down in history as the 12-Day War, was in many ways like a dress rehearsal for today's greater war. Israel moved immediately after the 2-month negotiation period set by U.S. President Trump expired and bombed dozens of Iran's nuclear facilities. More than 200 fighter jets entered Iranian territory. Natanz and Isfahan were struck. The Chief of Staff of Iran's armed forces and the commander of the Revolutionary Guards lost their lives. On June 22nd, America also formally entered this war. B-2 bomber aircraft struck the Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan nuclear facilities, and on June 24th, a ceasefire was declared. That 12-day war brought no resolution. The only thing it brought was showing everyone that Iran was being pushed further into a corner and that a major conflict was now inevitable. On February 28, 2026, that inevitable conflict began. The operation, launched under the code name Epic Fury, was the product of a coordination unprecedented in modern military history. The U.S. and Israeli air forces were managed from a joint operations center. Iran's air defense systems were neutralized within the first few hours. Military installations and missile systems in Tehran, Isfahan, Qom, Karaj and Kermanshah were targeted. Iran immediately moved to retaliate. Ballistic missiles were directed toward Israeli territory. At the same time, U.S. bases in Qatar and Iraq also came under Iranian attack. A proposal to close the Strait of Hormuz was brought onto the agenda of the Iranian parliament, a proposal that represented the world's greatest fear in terms of oil markets. What does the battlefield look like after the first 72 hours? More than 200 civilians have lost their lives in Iran, with hundreds more wounded. In Israel, air defense systems are operating at full capacity against Iranian missiles. U.S. warships are deployed in the Gulf, and the world is watching in astonishment, wondering where this war is heading. The news that the war had begun hit the financial markets like a bomb. Brent crude oil surged sharply within just a few hours. Gold prices approached all-time highs. The S&P 500 on Wall Street fell hard in the first few days. Defense company stocks, on the other hand, shot upward in the opposite direction. This is a classic war reflex. Whenever a major geopolitical crisis begins, markets panic first. Oil, gold, and the dollar go up. Risk appetite falls. But the real issue is how long this initial shock will last and how long the war will drag on. Because the market's true fear is not the war itself, but the uncertainty that the war creates. If there is a red line in this war, that line is the Strait of Hormuz. Approximately 21% of the world's oil trade passes through this narrow waterway. On average, 21 million barrels of crude oil are transported through this strait by tankers every day. The vast majority of the oil exported by Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Iraq passes through here. Iran threatened to close Hormuz. What happens if this threat is carried out? Analysts calculate that oil prices could quickly surpass $150 per barrel. And this doesn't just mean rising gas prices. Oil is the raw material of everything. Every sector, from plastics to chemicals, from transportation to electricity, will feel this increase. However, there is an interesting paradox here. Over the last 10 years, America has become the world's largest producer of oil and natural gas. Thanks to the shale oil revolution, the U.S. has largely achieved energy independence. Its dependence on Middle Eastern oil is far less than it was in the 1970s and 1980s. What does this mean? Even if Hormuz closes, the U.S. will suffer far less damage compared to other major economies. But for Europe and Asia, this scenario is nothing short of a disaster. And that indirectly affects the U.S. as well. War always creates a two-sided economic effect. While there is destruction and loss on one side, sectors that make incredible gains emerge on the other. And one of the biggest winners of war is always the defense industry. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, Boeing Defense Division. The stocks of these companies began gaining value with the start of the war. Why? Because this war means enormous consumption of weapons and ammunition. Every missile, every bomb, every drone used by the U.S. and Israel comes off the production lines of these companies. And every weapon used is replaced by a new order. The total U.S. spending in the Afghanistan war, which lasted from 2001 to 2021, reached $2.3 trillion. The cost of the Iraq war exceeded $2 trillion. The vast majority of that money flowed into the pockets of defense contractors. This war will be no different. The Pentagon's budget will increase and the defense industry will see record growth. But let's look at the dark side of things. The energy price increases created by the war could reignite inflation that is already being brought under control in the U.S. If gas prices rise, transportation costs increase. If transportation costs increase, the price of all kinds of goods increases. If energy prices rise, the cost of industrial production increases. And this domino effect ultimately hits the wallets of ordinary Americans. For the Federal Reserve, this situation creates a real dilemma. If inflation rises again, the Fed may have to halt its rate-cutting process, or even raise rates. This pushes mortgage rates higher, makes consumer loans more expensive, and increases the borrowing costs of businesses. In short, consumer spending, which is the engine of the economy, slows down. Analysts forecast that if the conflict does not exceed 3 months, global growth estimates could see a downward revision of 0.2 to 0.4 percentage points. But if the conflict drags on and Hormuz actually closes, these numbers will change dramatically. Stagflation, meaning both recession and high inflation at the same time, comes onto the agenda. In every major global crisis, investors around the world search for safe havens. And historically, these safe havens are the US dollar, US Treasury bonds, gold, and the Swiss franc. This war is following the same pattern. The dollar is gaining value and investors are pulling out of emerging markets and taking shelter in US assets. This may look favorable for the US economy in the short term. A strong dollar makes imports cheaper and preserves Americans' purchasing power. However, a strong dollar also makes American exports more expensive, making American products less competitive against the rest of the world. Everything from Boeing aircraft to agricultural products, from technology exports to defense equipment becomes more expensive. And one more point. The more the world takes shelter in the dollar during every crisis, the more dominant America's position in the global financial system becomes. This is a long-term strategic advantage for America. In 1973, Arab countries imposed an oil embargo on Western nations that supported Israel. Immediately following the Yom Kippur War, OPEC member Arab countries halted oil sales, particularly to the US and the Netherlands. The result? It was dramatic. Oil prices alone rose by 300%. Gas lines formed across the US, long lines at gas stations, and at times fights breaking out while waiting in line. Inflation completely lost control. The U.S. economy fell into the stagflation trap in 1973 to 1974. Inflation climbed to 11%, growth stalled, and unemployment rose. When this crisis combined with the Watergate scandal that was already shaking Richard Nixon's presidency, American society experienced the 1970s as a truly dark period of pessimism. So what is the lesson to be drawn from 1973? Energy dependence means economic vulnerability. That is why every U.S. president after 1973 treated energy independence as a matter of national security. With the shale revolution, the U.S. largely achieved this in the 2000s. An important difference between today's war and the 1973 crisis stems from exactly this point. The 1991 Gulf War, which began after Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, bears similarities to today's situation in many ways. Before the war, oil prices rose sharply. The atmosphere of uncertainty shook consumer confidence and stock markets declined. The U.S. entered a mild recession at the end of 1990. However, the Gulf War ended with a ground offensive that lasted only 100 hours, and victory was achieved decisively. What happened? Markets recovered quickly. Oil prices fell. The stock market showed a V-shaped recovery. And most analysts say this today. The atmosphere of uncertainty created by the war was far more destructive than the war itself. When the uncertainty ended, the markets breathed a sigh of relief. It is important to keep this lesson in mind. If today's war also ends with a short and decisive outcome, the American economy could recover much faster than you might think. The Afghanistan and Iraq wars that began after the September 11th attacks gave concrete form to what American economists called the Long War. And the economic cost of these wars was unlike anything seen in history. Economists Joseph Stiglitz and Linda Bilmes calculated that the total bill for the Iraq War, including indirect costs, exceeded $3 trillion. A portion of that money flowed to the defense industry, security companies, and American firms that received reconstruction contracts. Contractors like Halliburton, Blackwater, and KBR made billions of dollars from these wars. But the American Treasury took on an enormous debt burden. The U.S. public debt to GDP ratio, which was 55% in 2001, exceeded 90% by 2010. And bring it to today. The U.S. is already carrying around $36 trillion in public debt. A new long war will increase that burden even further. Who will pay in the end? As always, American taxpayers and future generations. The Iran-Iraq War, which lasted 8 years, was one of the longest and most devastating wars in the Middle East. Nearly 1 million people lost their lives in this war. And the U.S. took a very interesting position in this war. Officially neutral, but in practice a power supporting Iraq. The direct impact of this war on the American economy was limited, but its indirect effects were significant. Tanker traffic in the Gulf came under attack multiple times. The U.S. was forced to deploy its naval forces to the region to protect its tankers. In 1988, the U.S. destroyer USS Vincennes shot down an Iranian passenger aircraft, mistaking it for a fighter jet, killing 290 civilians. This incident painfully demonstrated how badly a miscalculation can lead to catastrophe. Looking at the oil market of the 1980s, we see this. Throughout the war period in the Gulf, oil prices fluctuated constantly, but the world managed to avoid a devastating collapse. The adaptive capacity of markets is often stronger than predictions suggest. Now let's ask the most important question. Could this war actually be good for America? The answer will be, it depends on who you ask and which time frame you look at. If this operation concludes successfully and Iran's nuclear program is truly dismantled, there will be very serious strategic gains for both the U.S. and Israel. First, the threat of Iran reaching nuclear weapons will be pushed back by at least 10 years. Second, the strength of the Shia resistance axis in the region will be broken. Hezbollah had already suffered a major defeat, and Iran's influence in Syria had weakened. Now Iran itself is the focus of the war. Third, the Trump administration will be able to send a powerful mission-accomplished message to the domestic public, and this message is a politically valuable gain in the short term. A portion of the American public will read this operation as a sign of strong leadership. Here is an interesting economic calculation. Iran accounts for approximately 3% of the world's oil production and produces around 3.5 million barrels of oil per day. However, due to U.S. sanctions, the majority of Iran's oil was being sold to China through secret channels. If Iran's oil exports are completely blocked after the war, this will push oil prices up in the short term. But in the long term, other producers, led by Saudi Arabia, will increase their capacity to fill this gap. And this will indirectly balance oil prices. Looking at the bigger picture, American shale oil companies directly benefit from every rise in oil prices. Production. Across shale fields stretching from Texas to Oklahoma and North Dakota, multiplies profit margins when oil prices are high. This war could also represent a wealth transfer for American oil companies. In a war environment, American weapons exports increase dramatically. NATO allies, Gulf countries, Israel, all of them place large orders to increase their defense capabilities. Demand for American-made weapons skyrockets, from F-35 fighter jets to Patriot missile systems, from HIMARS systems to unmanned aerial vehicles. The U.S. is already the world's largest arms exporter. More than 40% of global arms trade is supplied by American firms. This war will increase that share even further, and every F-35 sold, every Patriot system delivered creates jobs in American factories and secures contracts for American technology companies. Now let's look at the darkest scenario. What happens if Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz? If this scenario plays out, the world economy will face an unprecedented energy shock. Oil prices could climb above $150, even $200. Europe and Asia's energy imports will be severely disrupted. The majority of China's crude oil imports from the Middle East pass through Hormuz. If it closes, the Chinese economy will face serious pressure, and China will not sit back and watch this pressure idly. The already tense situation in Taiwan could become even more complicated. The global economy experiencing tension on two separate fronts simultaneously could genuinely collapse world markets. This is what analysts call a black swan scenario. Unlikely to happen, but devastating if it does. Iran possesses one of the most advanced cyber warfare capabilities in the Middle East. In the Shamoon cyber attack on Saudi Arabia's state oil company Aramco in 2012, 35,000 computers were taken out of operation. Iran was assessed to be connected to that attack. Today, this capability is far more advanced. A coordinated cyber attack against U.S. infrastructure could cause serious damage to energy grids, financial systems, and transportation networks. America's preparedness for this threat has grown significantly since 2012, but no system is 100% reliable. On the other hand, Iran's proxy forces in the region could also spring into action. The Houthis in Yemen could once again attack cargo ships and oil tankers. Shia militias in Iraq could target U.S. bases. This multi-front pressure creates a serious burden on U.S. resources. Finally, let's touch on perhaps the most sensitive issue: American casualties. The U.S. lost more than 7,000 soldiers combined in the Afghanistan and Iraq wars. These losses left deep marks on American public opinion. Today, the vast majority of American voters are against a ground offensive, against a war that would mean American soldiers dying. The Trump administration plans to conduct this war largely through air power. Direct engagement by ground forces is not expected in the short term, but wars do not go as planned. If Iran launches an attack targeting U.S. personnel in retaliation and American soldiers lose their lives, public pressure will push the Trump administration into a difficult corner. If the war ends with a controlled ceasefire within 1 to 3 months, the American economy is ready to absorb this shock. The panic experienced in the early moments could give way to a rapid recovery with ceasefire news that markets read as a good outcome. Oil prices normalize. The Fed continues its interest rate policy, and revenues coming from the war industry balance out the losses in other parts of the economy. In this scenario, the U.S. could close out 2026 with a reasonable growth rate, perhaps below 2%, but positive growth. The defense sector experiences a boom. The energy sector remains strong. And Trump uses this success as a major card in domestic politics. The war lasts 3 to 6 months, no definitive outcome emerges, but Hormuz does not remain closed either. In this case, the American economy enters a period of stagnation. Consumer confidence falls. Investments move into a wait-and-see mode. The Fed freezes its rate-cutting process. GDP growth slips to between 1 and 1.5%. Unemployment rises slightly. This scenario is an economically painful but manageable picture. America has come through periods like this many times before. The 1990 to 91 recession was followed by boom growth in 1993. After the shock of 2001, the economy recovered. The historical pattern shows that the American economy is extremely resilient against short-term shocks. Hormuz closes, the war exceeds 12 months, spreads across the region, China moves on Taiwan. This scenario is no longer just one country's economic problem. It means a global restructuring. In this scenario, dollar dominance could be shaken, the international trade order could change, and the world could genuinely enter a new Cold War order. However, the probability of this scenario materializing is currently low, because China attacking Taiwan would activate the entire Western alliance. This is not a rational move for China either, and Iran completely closing Hormuz means the end of its own oil revenues as well, which is an unsustainable strategy for Iran in the long run. Was this war really necessary? Historians will debate this question for years. On one side, there's an Iran that has been advancing toward developing nuclear weapons and pursuing destabilizing policies across the Middle East. On the other side, there's the debate over how legitimate it is to resort to military force before diplomatic channels have been fully exhausted. Those who remember the 2003 Iraq War know that war was also launched on the grounds of a dangerous regime possessing weapons of mass destruction. But post-war Iraq did not transform into the democratic and stable country that was expected. On the contrary, new threats like ISIS emerged in the region and Iran's regional influence grew. In other words, while the aim in 2003 was to neutralize a threat from the region, the groundwork was being laid for even bigger problems. Similar questions must be asked today. Will military intervention weaken the regime in Iran or strengthen it? Will Iranians who have been attacked rally around the regime or turn against it? The historical pattern shows that foreign attacks most often strengthen the nationalist reflex. What does America want from this war? The Trump administration's stated goal is the dismantling of the nuclear program, but the real strategic objectives may go far beyond that. Breaking Iran's regional influence, weakening Hezbollah, defeating Russia and China in the field. These are the big cards sitting under the table that are never spoken aloud. And there are economic interests as well. Bringing the flow of oil in the Gulf region under U.S. control, securing the safety of Middle Eastern oil toward Western markets, limiting China's influence in this region. All of these make up the political economic backdrop of the war. But history also shows this. Starting a war is easy. Ending a war is hard. And building peace after a war costs far more than the war itself. Here is where we have arrived. The world entered a new era starting February 28, 2026. No one knows for certain today how this era will take shape, but history offers us some anchors. America has managed to emerge stronger from short and decisive wars. The 1991 Gulf War is the best example of this, but it has come out worn down and weakened from long and uncertain wars. Afghanistan and Iraq are the most painful proof of that. Which one this war will resemble will become clear in the months ahead. The short term looks challenging for the American economy. Pressure on oil prices, volatility in markets, inflation risk, political uncertainty. But in the medium and long term, if the war remains controlled, the U.S. could gain strategic benefits from the growth of its defense industry, rising energy prices, and the value of the dollar through the safe haven effect. And let us say this as a final word. This war could fundamentally change the future of the Middle East, the global energy order, and the relationships between major powers. The world is evolving away from unipolar U.S. dominance toward a multipolar and far more complex balance. This war could be one of the most painful turning points of that evolution. Keep watching, because history continues to be written, and this time, All of us are inside history. This content was prepared for a YouTube documentary. It is based on real events, and some sections contain analytical assumptions.